And when he joined the startup, he found himself in a very tricky position where he was incapable of actually understanding precisely what he needed to do and found it very difficult to find the information. And after various discussions with Jouke, he decided to set up the European SAMD, and in order to give everyone a chance to discuss and for startups and organizations in this field to share their experiences and share best practices. He's done so for, I think, a number of years. And then ultimately, he unfortunately left the medical device industry, started working somewhere else, and he set up his own company, which is not a medical device company, unfortunately. And he asked us if we were willing to take it over, and we were. And we've tried this year to introduce new life into the European SAMD, and this is why we're here today. So this is already, as mentioned, the 25th one. I think it's the third one this year, however. The platform, it's specifically intended to promote open communication, open collaboration. Everyone is welcome. It's not a speaker only who has the ability to actually talk and provide input. So there's a very good option also to ask questions and get your answers. And we're always looking for voluntary speakers that are willing to contribute to the sessions. So for today, we found Hsuan from Scarlet, and she is willing to give the perspective from a notified body on the validation of LLMs. And also Cécile from the Heijden to give a little bit of the legal background around how LLMs should be regulated in the medical device field. Unfortunately, we asked Despina Ioannidou from Cofrix if she'd be willing to give the manufacturer's perspective, but she unfortunately was unable to attend due to a private event. So I'll try to cover for her by laying down what quality system requirements are when you're using an LLM within a medical device, which is also, I think, a quite interesting topic, and there's a lot of developments around it and already some developments within the AI Act. I think that's about it for my introduction. I'm not sure, Ivo, so you're here as well. Maybe you have anything you want to add from your perspective? Anything I may have missed? I guess the silence is a no. Then I think also out of the interest of time, I would suggest that we start. I have to admit that I'm not fully remembering what order we set out in the agenda. So Cécile or Yun, I think we asked either one of you to start. I think Cécile, right? If I remember correctly. So Cécile, can I hand it over to you, and maybe you can do a quick introduction for yourself as well?
Yeah, of course. My name's, while I start sharing my presentation, so I hope this all goes well. My name is Cécile van der Heijden. I'm an attorney at Axon Lawyers in Amsterdam. Been an attorney for nearly 12 years now. 9 years at this firm, and my specialty is, it's a bit broader than medical devices. I focus on everything horizontally surrounding medical devices. So the AI Act is fully in scope of what I do, but also data protection, environmental, that kind of thing. And I'm trying to find my presentation in the meanwhile. There it is. So I hope that seems to be visible. I'll go to full screen if that's works. Oh, there we are. Anyway, yeah. So legal introduction. Again, it is an introduction. It's Leon kindly gave me 15 minutes, but if you throw in a quarter, I'll talk all day, and we still have something to discuss. So just an introduction. I'm a lawyer, so legalese is what I do. This is all my personal opinion. So LLMs really aren't something that are addressed as such in the AI Act. We have general purpose AI models, and then we have AI systems. And don't bother reading all this. I'm sure we can share the slides, Leon. If not, I'll probably throw them on LinkedIn anyway. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that AI Act says, well, general purpose AIs are really something different than AI systems, which is, if you look at it, a lot of legalese, but there's a purpose to that. The general purpose AI models. Yeah.
Cécile, sorry to interrupt. You're still on the first slide.
Oh, that's weird.
Not moving.
For me, it's moving on. I'll have to do it
and
like this, if that's all right.
And you're not in presentation mode, so it's very small because we can see both the preview and also the actual slide.
I was on presentation mode and it was moving for me. So let me try again. Okay. If it doesn't, I'll keep it like this and I'll zoom in. All right?
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, let me go back and forth. Does that do? That does not do anything. Okay. It does work for you guys, because now my miniature doesn't do anything. Okay. Perfect.
No, it's
Let's see what it does.
okay. So currently we see the slide LLM defined.
Yeah, and if I move now, does it now change to anything else?
No.
Okay, then I am going to make this very small and make my presentation really big in the hope that that helps. Is this readable for you guys?
Yes, I think we
Okay,
can see.
then we'll just have to do it like this.
Okay. Thank you.
I didn't miss anything interesting because I had a very long slide with text of which I just described the first sentence. So this is where we get to the interesting part. General purpose AI models, this is where we would typically find the LLMs, the AI models that were, for example, trained with a large amount of data using self-supervision at scale, but that display significant generality and are capable of performing a wide range of distinct tasks, regardless of how it's placed on the market, and that can be integrated into a variety of downstream systems or applications. AI systems is what we typically focus on when we're dealing with medical devices, because these are the machine-based systems that are designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy and that can exhibit adaptiveness and which infer something based on the input that they receive. So they create a certain output, which can be a recommendation, it can be a prediction, it can be content, it can be a decision. So these are very different topics. Not every LLM, of course, is a medical device. Question that you need to keep asking yourself is, guys, does this actually have a medical purpose? So moving on, just briefly, European Commission did put out some guidance, I think it was last year, where they basically expand on this definition that you just saw for AI systems. And I'm including this because I want to focus on the definition later, but just realize that the inference aspect, the being able to independently do something with input, that's the key thing for the European Commission to say that something is an AI system. So why does this all matter for LLMs? That's because an LLM, or at least general purpose AI model, as I should call it in the legal terminology, can become a high-risk AI system. And that is when it is, for example, integrated in an AI system where you put on your trademark on something. So basically we have a similar clause in the MDR and IVDR where we say, well, look, if you're changing the purpose for something that wasn't a high-risk AI system, we're including an LLM into our medical device, for example, then it can become a high-risk AI system, and then you become the manufacturer of that. So just the fact that something is called an LLM doesn't mean it can't be also a medical device high-risk AI system that's regulated under MDR and the AI Act. And then it's either high risk or it's not. What we would typically look at is Article 6 of the AI Act. That's core of when something is a high-risk AI system. So MDR and IVDR are listed in Annex 1 of the AI Act. So if an AI system that is also a medical device either is a safety component of a product, or the product AI system itself is a product, and then it's covered by the MDR or IVDR, and it undergoes third-party conformity assessment, it becomes a high-risk AI system, and that means that the whole regime will apply to that, and that's a lot of obligations right now, and there's a lot of discussion, and we'll get to that in a bit. Thing to remember, not all LLMs are medical devices. You can have LLMs that are used in healthcare that are really just focusing on operational aspects, or that are merely used in research. And then we have the clinical use of LLMs, where you really get into the medical device territory, where you have diagnosis assistance, triage, clinical decision support, treatment recommendations. Everything else, it's not a medical purpose, you don't end up in the AI, in the medical device AI setting, even if the LLM is used in a medical setting. And medical scribes I'll get to in a bit more detail. So as I said, it's not all healthcare. You have the AI model, you have the AI system, and you have the medical device. Legally, they are really three different things. But of course, a product can involve all three. It can be a LLM that was incorporated into a medical device and becomes a high-risk AI system under the AI Act. A foundation model as such is not normally placed on the market for a specific medical purpose. So what you really need to start looking at is how is this model used? What is your downstream developer building around it? What is that system intended to do, and how is that output presented for use? And then the AI Act creates that classification that I just saw you with, it's an AI model or it's a high-risk AI system, and if it's a high-risk, if it's an AI system and it undergoes third-party conformity assessment, etc., then it becomes a high-risk AI system. So you get a bit of layered approach where you then have to deal with MDR and IVDR and the AI Act at the same time. And unfortunately, we're still in the middle of legal developments, so things are still a bit vague, and I'll show you a bit on that. As I said, you need to look at what's the actual intended purpose of the AI. Summarize a consultation really is something entirely different from identify a likely diagnosis from this consultation. An AI tool for research, however, can become a medical device if you repackage it. So if you start using it in individual patient care. If something's sold to you as admin support, then it can become a clinical decision support because the claims change or user reliance change. So same user, in the end, same user interface could also contain both non-medical and medical functions. And then that's where we will look at what we commonly would do with the software as a medical device guidance from the MDCG, where we look at the different modules. Now, modules is not language that the AI Act knows, but since we're also dealing with medical devices, in some of these cases, their modules are a common concept. Legal uncertainty really arises where the user interface really invites physicians to rely on generated reasoning, yet the manufacturer says, well, it's just administrative. Same thing is, you don't really see the issues where you have obvious diagnostic tools, but tools that start selecting or prioritizing or interpreting clinically relevant information become very quickly very borderline and quickly flow into medical device and a sphere. And that means you do need to assess case by case, unfortunately. So, hot off the press, there was case law. I think this was published 2 weeks ago. The Centrale versus Diagram Halbach decision. Ignore the name, you don't need to remember it. All I need you to remember is the fact that traditionally we look at intended purpose only to say something is a medical device and on claim, and we look to the claims made by the manufacturer. But the European Court of Justice, which is, just for your background knowledge, the highest court in the European Union, says no. Well, the statements of the manufacturer need to concern the actual use of the product, and then the product needs to be capable of performing that function within the scope of the definition of a medical device. Use in a general healthcare setting does not mean that something is a medical device, and that applies to AI systems just as much as LLMs. So really, it's a bit of a more narrow definition of intended purpose than that we had until now. But this is an important one to take home. As I said, I would like to look into the AI scribes based on what I just said. So, maybe one about this slide. The case was about medical bracelets patients used, and the manufacturer tried to sell them, I believe, as a medical device. Yet the only thing they really did was patient administration. So the court decided it had no medical purpose. AI scribes then, but the question you need to ask there is, what does the scribe do with the input after listening to a conversation? If it's just recording, describing, maybe even a little structuring or inserting the information into the electronic health system, it's definitely not a medical device. If it's suggesting, hey physician, you really need to do this and this testing, or did you look at these risk scores? I just thought them up. Definitely a medical device. When it starts extracting information or starts suggesting missing questions, then you're quickly entering into medical device territory. But then it comes down to what exactly does it do. It's borderline in those cases. But most AI scribes that just write down your notes are not medical devices, thus far. Okay, and I'll be very quick because I know we're running out of time and there are much more interesting things to talk about than the legal parts. These were on the slide. You see the timelines that were applicable and pretty much up till now, because we've had some legal developments. Timelines weren't workable. That's all I need you to know, because this is changing. AI Act is supposed to be applicable from 2nd of August 2026 in general, and then the high risk regime was supposed to become applicable from 2nd of August next year. But we've had the digital omnibus. Part of this was changes to the AI Act. That part has been adopted. There was also a part about data protection legislation, which also contains relevant things if you're dealing with a medical device AI. But that part is still undergoing significant discussions in Brussels. So just the AI part right now. Timelines are being moved. I don't believe it has been published yet, so it's not yet applicable, the digital omnibus, but it has been adopted, so it should be fine to take me on my word here. We have a new legal basis for the use of personal data for bias detection. We're narrowing the definition of safety component. So that's good. The intended purpose really needs to be to prevent or mitigate risks to the health and safety of persons or property. Only then you can be a safety component. AI systems that are merely used for non-safety related aspects of user assistance, such as performance optimization, do not qualify as safety components. That's now an explicit rule in the AI Act. We're improving on the use of regulatory sandboxes, which can now actually include medical device AI. Not a topic today, but interesting to know. And there are some additional changes towards the designation of conformity assessment bodies, in other words, the notified bodies. So it is becoming a bit more easy, but it's still chaos. Because we don't only have the digital omnibus, which was meant to be just simplification, we also have the targeted revision of MDR and IVDR, which also says something about the AI Act. Great for me as a lawyer. I love this stuff. Terrible if you're working in the field, because this is legal chaos. What the proposal of the MDR revision says is they want to move, what I said earlier, medical devices, the MDR and IVDR are listed in Annex 1, Part A, I should have said, of the AI Act, which is why they can be high-risk AI systems, any products that fall under them. They want to move it to Part B, which means that a large part of the high-risk regime will not, if this enters into force, will not apply to medical device AI systems. Brilliant idea, except for one tiny little thing, namely the European Commission may use its implementing and delegated powers to apply some of the obligations again to medical devices. When they're going to do that, I have no clue. What they're going to have medical device manufacturers comply with, I still don't have any clue. So this is vague, and we won't have certainty until the European Commission uses this right. Important to note here, this is very much still undergoing legal discussion. The proposal for the targeted revision is still with the European Parliament and the Council. So it's absolutely not certain that this will enter into force and make your life somewhat easier or more uncertain. So I hope we'll have some clarity here soon, but from what I've heard, negotiations are difficult. So don't count on this entering into force, because they tried something similar with the digital omnibus to move the medical device AI from the scope of the AI Act, similar system as I just mentioned here, and it didn't succeed there. So we'll have to see whether it works for the targeted revision. Unfortunately, I don't have better news than this. And I think we'll take questions at the end. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Anyone questions? Feel free to raise your hand and just shoot. Otherwise, I'll happily start with a question. And maybe a short comment, Cécile, we had a discussion, I guess, earlier this week with the Dutch healthcare authorities, and we understood that the timelines for the start, and I may have misremembered, so I might be saying this wrong, but the trilogue discussions on the MDR IVDR simplification proposal won't start before November, probably this year. So still a little bit far away. And then I guess they still need to go through the whole trilogue discussion, which will take at least a few months. So maybe we'll know more beginning of next year, maybe before the summer. It's slow. And then considering that there will be another transition year, I guess, left, because August 2028 will be the date of application. It's still a very short timeline. What they did confirm is that and the confirmation is their expectation is that when the move from Section A to B under Annex 1 will potentially happen, is that they will also immediately set out the the implementing act, and they expect that to come in force at the same time, or at least that's what they're pushing for. But also there, it's probably not 100% certain, but it's a very uncertain times. Let's say the least of it.
At least you can say, Leon, that the Q2 suggestion by the European Commission next year is still ambitious.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, and my actual question is more on the court case that you showed. Could you show the slide again? I really had a hard time reading and understanding it and understanding the implications. And my question is more around, so if this is the court ruling, does that mean then that the publication of this ruling could affect, for example, decisions that are made within, for example, in guidance in MDCG, and could it affect how regulators will start interpreting whether scribes, for example, should or should not be medical devices based on the intended purpose? Or are those really two entirely separate?
I think honestly you should. This is the highest instance that we have. They can overrule the European Commission on how something is read. So from that perspective, I would expect this to have quite a big impact. So basically, what you see is that they really add this. So it needs to be the actual use. The product needs to be able to be capable to have that functionality. The reason why this is difficult to read is because it works the other way around. Because this was a product that said, the manufacturer said it's a medical device, and it turned out not to really have medical device functionality, even though they claimed it had. But it's case law. It's bound to be unreadable, honestly.
Yeah, I am curious if other people have questions about it, because it's not clear entirely to me.
So we're really moving away from manufacturer says it's a medical device. Although it can do more, it's really moving towards, well, if it can do more.
So if you apply this to an AI scribe, what it actually says is that if you claim that the AI scribe is intended for medical intended purpose, such as therapy or diagnostic features, but it doesn't do anything else but create a summary, basically, and the summary itself may be used for diagnosis or therapy, but it doesn't perform any action on data beyond
it's just
summarization.
Yeah.
So it doesn't do any interpretation, it doesn't create any diagnosis, it doesn't create any treatment advice, none of those sorts. It will most likely not be considered a medical device.
Yes. So the thing that caused so much confusion about AI scribes is also the British MHRA that had opinions about AI scribes. And obviously they don't necessarily have to follow this because they're no longer in the EU. But for the EU, this should settle some of the discussion.
Let's see. Let's see and wait
Hopefully.
what they come back with. I guess we're still pending also a decision, I think, to be published in the borderline conformity, what's it called again? The borderline classification manual on
but
AI
they
scribes.
should follow this. They can't really overrule this.
Yeah. There are no other questions for Cécile? No one? Then I'm just going to take over then on the QMS aspects for AI scribes. And a big thank you, Cécile, for your help and for bringing this topic to the table here this evening. I think it's super relevant, and I'm really, really interested in seeing how this is going to play out in the field. I am always also a little bit struggling having two screens, but you can see my screen, right? Everything is clear, I guess. Okay, thanks. So as mentioned, unfortunately, this Pina had to drop out, but I think also very relevant is how do you actually manage LLMs when you incorporate them into a medical device. And I think, Cécile, you already pointed some of these items out, and it very much touches and goes on, I think, where you left it. So a very quick summary, right, in November 2022, and we seem to forget that every now and then, is when the first LLM actually came to market, which to me is an insane timeline. We're only 4 years further down the line, and you see AI and LLMs being used everywhere in any field that people work in, but also in our daily field within regulatory affairs, but also in medical devices. In March 2025, we actually saw the first CE-marked LLM as a medical device class 2B. I tried to understand the Professor Valmet intended purpose and their IFU, which are published on their website. I really am interested to see how that holds up against that case court ruling, Cécile, because if you read it carefully, it doesn't seem to actually give away a medical intended purpose. It just says that it can be used to query generic clinical information rather than actually patient-specific details. But somehow it got published as a medical device. And then we have the NHS guidance you already touched on, which was brought out in 2025 as well, where they note that AI scribes should be class 1 or higher. And we saw in May 2026 that Tandem got a visit from the Swedish healthcare authorities, which ruled, let's say at least agreed with Tandem Health that our product should be at least a class 2A medical device. And just recently in 2026, we saw the first LLM being cleared by the FDA. It was already supposedly cleared last year in December, but only got published by the FDA in the 510K database just recently. That's why it was only getting attention just recently. Very briefly, how an LLM fits, because we tend to look at medical devices towards the end product. But if you look at the LLM itself and how it's used, you clearly see that the LLM sits not within the medical device itself in most cases, but is actually managed somewhere else at a third party. And how it works is the clinician would query the system that's provided by the medical device manufacturer, and that medical device manufacturer provides a prompt overlayer and starts prompting the third-party LLM for a response that comes back, is undergoing some quality controls at the end of the manufacturer, and then goes back to the clinician. And the provider of the LLM actually, of the model, actually controls the model life cycle, and it's not so much the manufacturer who has any control over the third-party LLM, which in a medical device can be problematic. And if you look at the patient data, that's another aspect of this, and Cécile already mentioned it briefly as well. Patient data may flow out of the medical device into a third-party LLM, and it's even more so a black box than when you have the AI system within your own environment. Now you're sending patient data to an external LLM to assess and feed the output back to the medical device. So first things first, right? When you integrate an LLM to a product, the LLM itself becomes a super item. It's software of unknown provenance, whereas the FDA typically uses the term off-the-shelf software. And 62304 lays down already a list of specifications. For those who are not aware, the 62304 has undergone a quite significant upgrade. It should be published, for what I understand, next month. And it will also add an Annex A, where it will clarify how to deal with AI systems. So it's definitely one worth watching out for. Today, it already specifies that you must have your functional and performance requirements set out for the soup item, but also the hardware and software components that you need to support it. Evaluate known anomalies as far as we can be aware of those of third-party LLMs. Identify the model version that they're using so that you can actually pin it. I'll touch on it a little bit further. And you need to evaluate and implement soup updates through software maintenance. But this can be quite tricky, right? Because the supplier may update the model without notice, which is something you definitely want to prevent, especially in a medical device, right? We've just seen the Fable 5 being published. I think, sorry, not Fable 5, but just the model Fable by Anthropic. And I've seen some publications already that in some aspects in a medical device, actually Fable performs less well than the previous Opus 4.8. So it's not necessarily always an improvement when a new model is being published. The other part, indeed, the anomalies that I just pointed out, and the AI Act documentation, which I'll touch on in a second. And also exercise software library becomes obviously considerably harder for a model that is behind the API wall. Documentation, I'm not sure. I actually never considered this to be applicable until we started evaluating started supporting our first customers that have LLMs. But the AI Act actually already has Article 53, which says that the provider of a general purpose AI model must publish documentation when that models can be integrated into third-party AI systems. So you have, and this is a good differentiation, the AI Act talks about GPAI models and GPAI systems, where GPAI models can never be a medical device. But when it goes into a downstream GPAI system, like you see in a medical device, then the GPAI system can be a high-risk artificial intelligence system, such as a medical device under Annex 1. And then the model provider should make available a bunch of documentation, such as the intended tasks of the AI systems that they can be used for, the architecture and number of parameters used, the technical means required for integration, but also acceptable use policies, the modality and formats of inputs and outputs, but also the type provenance and curation of training, testing, and validation data. I guess if we ask people right now that are developing these type of devices, or people who may have already put those on the market, how much of this documentation they've probably obtained from the LLM manufacturer is probably going to be very limited. However, this is already applicable. This is not something that's yet to become applicable, since the requirements for GPAI systems already apply. And new models need to have this documentation if they were published after the 2nd of August of 25. And for ones that were already on the market, the deadline for them to have that data available is the 2nd of August 2027. And free and open source models, interestingly, are considered exempt unless they pose a systemic risk. But I think they actually are still required to provide this documentation irrespective of being made available open source. And the other part is indeed the written agreement, which is under Article 25, is also for these downstream providers of GPAI systems. They will also, the GPAI model provider, so again, the large language model provider like an Anthropic or OpenAI, they shall actually be required to sign off on an agreement with the third party, with the downstream the system manufacturer or provider. And they need to set out information capabilities, technical access, and other types of assistance. Also, the benchmark of generally acknowledged state of the art. And the purpose is to enable the manufacturer to actually fully comply with the AI Act. So there's a bunch of the requirements that you can already in contracts agree on with the third-party model provider. I think the AI Act also note that they will set out model clauses. I don't think that these are already available, but that doesn't mean that these requirements do not yet apply to those providers. So and here actually, so for the previous one, the open source exemption does apply, but for the contracts, it doesn't. So, and probably similar to other types of AI systems, to other types of big tech companies that will probably have their standard contractual agreements as part of their terms and conditions that you will need to agree to when you sign in or where you start using their devices. But irrespective, I would download them and keep them as part of your supplier selection process. So, and that brings us to the following, right? The LLM provider is actually a supplier to your organization. And when selecting them, again, that Annex 12 documentation should be available and should be up to date. You should have that agreement embedded. And I think one thing Cécile also called out explicitly, and it's very important to do a check on this, is whether medical use is actually waived in their terms and conditions. So if you start using a third-party model, do they actually allow you to use it for medical purposes? And some will have restrictions if you start using the terms and conditions, which is an essential check you must perform as regulatory to avoid that you're breaching their contractual terms or in their conditions. And obviously also assess their practices. And for example, right, their security posture, how do they deal with this, but also the availability of the model and when it runs in, how available is the model? We've seen Anthropic pull Fable from the market overnight. And clearly that was due to a political battle in the US. But still, if it's embedded in your medical device and it's the only model you've embedded in your medical device and it's being pulled out overnight in your medical device, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore, which can be really problematic. So you might also want to consider if you need to have potentially a second LLM provider as a backup. And therefore also consider reevaluating them at a higher frequency potentially than other conventional suppliers. Again, a check of their terms and conditions to make sure that you can use it in a medical context, the acceptable use policies that they set out, whether they're inputs and further training of the model. Well, if your inputs are actually used for training of their model, it's something you definitely want to avoid, right? You're using sensitive healthcare data. If you're sending that back into their model and they're training their model on the basis of that healthcare data, you're very likely to actually breach the privacy regulations, which is not your intention as a medical device manufacturer. And indeed, they publish the terms probably online, and they can probably just update them every now and then without informing you. So it's also very important to keep track of those and embed those as the reevaluation of the supplier. Then data protection, I think it's very clear, a straight cut example, right? It's healthcare data. It's a special type of personal information, and that also means, and not any different because it's special type of data, but you must have a data processing agreement. You're sending patient data to a third party, and they must ensure that their security controls are not going to be less than yours, that you agreed upon with the actual data controller, which can be a hospital or a general practitioner. The location, where does the data actually flow to? And what type of extra controls do you maybe need to put in place, but also the interaction logs that may contain healthcare data on their end. And you need to have information security controls in place. And potentially, you might want to consider doing a data protection impact assessment on the GDPR. You're using new technology, which is processing healthcare data. And ultimately, right, the requirement to execute the DPIA is on the end of the controller. But I would say as a data processor, it can really help you to demonstrate that you thought this through and you just don't send healthcare data to a third-party assessor without underlying data protection impact assessment. So it can definitely help you to demonstrate that you thought this through properly. Go ahead, Cécile.
Just very brief addition here. If your LLM provider is in the US, sorry, my dog also. If your LLM provider is in the US, the Supreme Court in the US has recently made a decision to say that the Federal Trade Association. Apologies for the dog. Don't know how much you can hear of him.
0.
Oh, brilliant! I just keep shouting because he's shouting. I think he heard something.
Nothing at all.
They're changing something in the US system due to a court decision by the European Court, by the Supreme Court of the US, meaning that there's no real independent oversight anymore. Max Schrems, who is representing an Austrian non-for-profit has already asked the European Commission, because of this, to withdraw the adequacy decision for the US, which will also, if that's withdrawn, it will also impact transfers to the US based on standard contractual clauses. So you need to be very careful about what's in any contract that you sign with the US, but especially if you're reliant on patient data there, because you may not be able to send data to the LLM provider in the US at a moment's notice.
Yeah, so that would mean in that event, right, it will be invalidated. That would mean that you cannot just base yourself on a data privacy impact assessment, on a data processing agreement. And on top of that, you would then need to have the standard contractual clauses and do a transfer.
You can't use standard contractual clauses anymore then. So you need to go to explicit patient consent, which can't be used for repetitive transfers. And your clients won't notice, but they will look angrily at you if you allow transfers that are not permitted.
Is it not either? Go ahead.
Is this also the case if the servers are and the LLM is run on servers in the EU?
So if the data stays in the EU, it's not a transfer, but if the US entity can log into those servers, it's again a transfer. And we're all quietly ignoring the US Cloud Act that allows them access anyway. But that gives you a bit of certainty, but not enough, because anyone from Microsoft or OpenAI, whatever, can still cooperate with the entities. I know Microsoft has standard contractual clauses and uses the adequacy decision for Microsoft Ireland and Microsoft Corp in the US still. So the data is moving. There is a sunset clause somewhere in your contracts, because they want to prove they want to ensure that the data remains available if the European servers are not.
It's just sad to hear that these political situations have such a dramatic impact on how we bring these technologies onto the European market. Also, the withdrawal of Fable by Anthropic, imagining that it's in a medical device, potentially helping European patients, and then it gets just withdrawn overnight, is just dramatic. I seriously hope that we'll see some regime change on the end of the United States soon, so that becomes a more reliable party going forward. Some items to consider in the contract, right? Change control, advanced notification of model update and deprecations. It could be painful if the LLM manufacturer just decide overnight to deprecate one of their models without you having at the time to actually update to a new model and test against a new model. Version pinning, right? So you don't want them to just automatically update the model on their end without informing you. And agreed minimum notice periods, exactly to avoid the first 2 points. And also access and support to the right amount of documentation, limits and failure modes, technical access, but also support for incident investigations, and potentially also security considerations such as the data processing agreement, but also security measures and incident notifications and commitments on availability and decommissioning terms. How much worth that contract will at the end turn out to be with having a big tech party on the other end? It's questionable, but not having anything is probably not going to be better. Obviously, verification testing, and I'll run through it very briefly. If you embed an LLM within your medical device, your quality management system should take care that you actually perform verification tests using it, making sure that it performs well, making sure that it can pass all the requirements that you set out for the model. And similar validation and clinical evidence, right? You need to make sure that the model that you're embedding in your medical device actually performs to the clinical level that you want it to perform, which can be a complex project, especially if you would use these models for a higher risk system where you may actually need to do a clinical study or clinical investigation. How does that work if you've done a clinical investigation? It's taking you a long time and then the model just gets withdrawn and they update a new model. Are you going to do a new clinical investigation? What's that going to look like? I think these are still some unsolved questions. Can you then retest on the data set that you that turned up on your clinical investigation? But for some instances, I could imagine if you have a tool specifically, for example, to address complaints for depression, where you need to do a prospective clinical investigation to demonstrate the performance, and you're unsure of whether a new model actually improved or gotten worse, you may need to redo your clinical investigation. Can be quite complicated. And typical failure modes, obviously, you need to test the LLM as well to the extent possible. And also, indeed, different patient groups, different languages, different, etc., to do your subgroup assessments. Model versions, availability, and change management. I think I talked about this already for quite a bit. But once you have your model embedded, you're expecting changes, maybe on your end, PCCP can be helpful. But also you want to avoid that in the event that third-party model provider is just changing their model, and you need to go back to your notified body, and the notified body is going to take 3 months to do the review because they have an enormous backlog or even longer. But in the meantime, the model has been withdrawn and you're not capable of implementing a new model, is going to bring you as a manufacturer into problems. So agreement here of a PCCP or arrangements with the notified body on how you can implement new models into your system is super relevant. Yeah, and also substantial modifications outside of the plan that may still need to go to the notified body. Make sure you discuss this with the notified body. And even in these events that you agree with the notified body that there might be a different way to, rather than PCP, but there might be some fast track with the notified body to get these changes approved. Ongoing monitoring, I think that's very clear, right? You need to monitor once the LLM has been used and has been implemented to ensure that you detect potential performance drift, but also review production and complaints for changes in the output of the quality, but also predetermined thresholds to determine investigation or rollbacks triggered, and log user and device interactions for incident investigation. The output of an LLM obviously is uncertain in the sense you can test it, you can prompt it very specifically, but as we all know, especially where the LLM is intended to support conversations between the user and the system, you might want to actually log all the interactions that have taken place so that if in the event that it's led to an incorrect outcome, you can always trace back what has gone wrong, what was being prompted by the end user towards the large language system. And then obviously also monitoring of the supplier on the other end, so not just the LLM itself, but also the supplier and all the items that I think I called out already before. And very briefly, just a quick overview where these things come into play under the MDR and the ISO 145. Clearly supplier and selection, evaluation and monitoring, but also the purchasing information agreements, the verification of the purchased products, so incoming verification of each model, the control of outsourced processes. And yeah, it's when the inference, for example, runs in their provider environment and not in yours. How do you deal with that? Is it an outsourced process then? It's a question. Design and development, I think I called out most of these items similar to verification, validation, design change control, and the software maintenance and configuration. And ultimately also post-market surveillance, complaint management, PMCF, how do you manage drift of the potential model, and document and record control, right, retention of the model documentation, the versioning of the records, and ultimately training and competence. For now, in line with the literacy obligation, which I think is being weakened slightly, unfortunately, due to the update to the AI Act. So it may not be as relevant anymore. But ensure that people are trained on using the device, but also the end user training is being evaluated as needed under 62366. So eventually, right, the key takeaways, the LLM provider is actually a critical supplier to your organization. You should manage the model as a soup item and write the change management and the post-market surveillance around the frequent model changes. And also have a PCCP where that is actually needed. I think maybe Yun from Scarlet can talk a little bit more to this. And finally, the security contract before you build, right? It determines how much control you ultimately have over the system and the data and the testing. Hopefully I'm sorry for the crazy amount of information in such a short slide deck, but I am quite sure that this is still relatively new technology and we see a lot of questions coming in. at MedQAIR, and we're trying our best to answer them to what we can. We see very little companies that have already understood the implications of the AI Act or are actively thinking about how to deal with this within their quality management system. But be assured that it will have quite some implications on the quality management system. So I'll stop here. If there's any questions, feel free to shoot. Anyone is welcome to ask questions, right? No question is stupid enough, and we're happy to have a discussion here. If other people can chime in, feel free to. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, let me turn my mic on as well. Yeah, thank you very much, Leon. Indeed, a lot of information on short notice. What stood out to me was the PCCP, the pre-approved change plan. I'm not sure what the abbreviation was exactly, but is that something that's also part of the MDR itself? Is it defined somewhere, like how to utilize it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and there's two answers to this. One is that the AI Act is actually introducing the predetermined change control plan. So the AI Act says if you have performance changes to your model that are pre-approved by the notified body, then you don't have to inform them proactively. It doesn't state anything about what should be in there. And I think the IVDR simplification proposal also brings forward the proposal to introduce the predetermined change control plans. So it will either through the AI Act or the MDR IVDR, the PCCP is actually becoming a legislative instrument that you can use to get forward. I think maybe the MDCG 2025-1 on the AI Act MDR interplay already notes something about it. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe Yoon from Scarlet, maybe you can comment on this if you're aware out of the top of your head.
So basically, I think PCCP is an idea that was common in the US. I think it's more popular with the FDA. And I think off the top of my head, I can't remember whether there's any specific guidance or EU MDR that already incorporated that into the regulations. But it's something that we have a pilot project at Scarlet, and we have introduced a PCCP. So outside, manufacturer can submit a predetermined change request plan when they were submitting the technical documentation, and we will review both the technical documentation as usual and also the PCCP. So later on, when they have a change request, they just need to inform us that they are going to do the change, and we'll do a very quick check, and then they can roll out the new functionalities.
Is this answering your question to some extent, Tom?
Yeah, definitely. I wrote down some reference materials, MDCG and FDA amongst them. Thank you.
Thank you. Diana?
Hi, I have a question. Thanks for the presentation, very informative. So you mentioned validation, and how can you validate an LLM that is not deterministic? Like, I'm afraid that maybe every answer would be something else. Is a way to standardize that and to present to notified body?
I think that's a good question for you, and she will do a presentation on this right afterwards, and she should give you some insights. I can give you my 2 cents on this. I think there's not a straightforward answer again. So you can use LLMs for a very specific narrow task. For example, to copy information from product 1 into product B. If it's just copy pasting of very specific details, it becomes already a little bit easier to validate such a tool. And I think I mentioned, and this is one example I struggle with. Let's say you have a mental health app that helps you to treat symptoms of depression, for example, but it doesn't give you, it gives you customized feedback to you as a person, rather than suggesting already proven cognitive treatment steps that you can undertake that are based on clinical evidence. Then you need to gather that clinical evidence yourself. And I think the only way to do that with these type of applications is probably through a prospective randomized trial. I couldn't see another way to do it. So it really depends on how you define the intended purpose, what your intended clinical benefit is, and how you intend to validate it. But again, I think Yoon will probably touch on this a little bit more in detail. Does that help for now, Diana? And are you okay with postponing perhaps the question for you?
Clear. Thanks.
Thanks. Theodora?
Yeah, hi. Just going back one step to what Tom was asking, the MDCG guideline that came out in 2025 that bridges the AI Act and the MDR or IVDR doesn't actually give any additional information on the PCCP. The only thing it says is that, at least at that time, the IMDRF was in the process of developing a guideline for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the IMDRF has published it meanwhile, right?
Yeah. But so the MDCG doesn't actually provide any kind of guidance on that. So
yeah, that's helpful to add. And thank you for that. I am trying to stay ahead and trying to keep up with all the guidance and legislation, but it's really, really tough to try to keep up. So that's why we have the European SAMD so that we can inform each other. So thanks for that. That's helpful. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Thank you once again so much for the presentation. I find it super informative. When we think about LLMs, we typically think about the text-based interface that we have with LLMs. There's also native audio models that are on the rise. And if I understand correctly, audio or voice of a user is treated as biometric information or data in the European Union. So is there any additional implications for using audio-based models when it comes to in this topic of LLMs?
It's a super good question, and I think I don't have a straightforward answer. Maybe Cécile can add some thought to this.
I can start with an answer, but I would have to look things up. So this is me talking top of my head. I believe there is case law that emphasizes that a voice is not always biometric data, because the idea of biometric, but again, I have to check this, so don't hold me to this. Biometric data is the use in security, in more of a security in an access setting. Otherwise, every video that you would take of a person would also be considered biometric data, in addition to personal data concerning health. If you could see that someone has broken his arm, whereas that's not a purpose of the model. Of the material that you're creating. So I don't think it's as strict as that. Just don't hold me to this.
Thank you so much. The only context based on my limited research is that when you, for example, perform an ambient recording of a practitioner and a patient, then LLMs, especially the audio LLMs, they have the ability to understand which speaker had spoken what, and I assume that could somehow lead to the regulatory bodies treating it as biometric information, because they have an ability to identify who said what.
I think there's also the issue that this really veers into GDPR territory, with what kind of data, and that's typically, and biometric really is regulated by the GDPR, which is not necessarily something that competent authorities or notified bodies are often well versed in. So you end up with a weird mismatch.
Thank you so much for the insights. Really appreciate it.
What are the points to implement AI safeguarding rules for different cases when, for example, a statement might be a treatment might get dangerous for one patient, but it can apply very successfully to another. So do you have anything like that in terms of ensuring that you are not affecting the patient care when it comes to applying?
Yeah, it's a super good question, and I think that's one of the harder parts with LLMs, right? Is that the outcome is always difficult to predict and to anticipate. And this is actually where I think that gathering clinical data, especially where the output may not be certain, and again, there's different levels of how you can implement LLM systems. For example, you can have very narrow tasks for LLM systems, where this is probably easier to put guardrails around, whereas in the example of having an LLM that helps with treating symptoms for depression, this is probably going to be much harder, right? How do you ensure that? And I think the relevant answer is in how the safeguards are being built in by the manufacturer into the prompts, into the restrictions of the AI model, and how it can answer. And you will need to demonstrate that through your clinical data, which again, I think Yun will probably touch on in her presentation. I'm not sure if this is a proper answer to your question.
Well, it should be very specific to the context, and it should be validated to ensure that we are not getting different outputs for patients that might have similar issues, and the other way around, different patients get the same output, because everything is different, but interpretation might be very tricky in terms of applying the safeguards. So here it can be specific to country, also to country regulation, to model that you can use, because my understanding is that you have a lot of restrictions in basically orchestrating anthropic models or anything that is applying from ES. So there will be a lot of factors to be considered to get the right answer here. So I don't have any specific medical case, fortunately, but are you basically dealing mostly with LLM for mental diseases or for any kind of medical care? Is there anything specific to the illness, or?
We see different types of LLMs being used. Maybe anyone else will want to say something about this. Is there anyone who can speak to this? Go ahead, Tom.
So I at least know an example of a company that used AI to assess the brain imagery, and in that sense, to validate their model, they didn't do a they could do a retroactive study with existing images, and then clinical specialists and they did a reader study. So the LLM scored the images, and then the clinicians did it in parallel, and thereby they could compare the output. Yeah, so you don't always need to do a clinical investigation if you have enough backwards data to use.
This, I would imagine, is then a multimodal system where you have an LLM combined with an image and assessment algorithm, where you look at the retrospective data and the ground truth that you have from the medical images, where the algorithm also pulls in data from the EHR. Yeah, they're talking again, and I think that's where the complexity is, right? This is a more narrow use case where I think that can be a little bit more simple compared to where you have a use case where, for example, in the event of treating depression, for example, it can be such a wide range of answers you can obtain from an LLM that it becomes really difficult to narrow it down, I would say, to only safe answers. I also don't have a very clear answer, but maybe we should go to the presentation of Yun and see if Yun can say anything from a perspective of the notified body, and continue the discussion after that. Is that okay for Yun? Yun, are you ready to take over?
Yeah, sure. Let me just figure out how to share my screen.
In the lower bar, you'll have
just want to share a particular screen instead of my entire screen. So let me check. Okay, let me just share my entire screen. Anyway, okay, can you see my slides? So Figma, are you able to see my slides?
All clear. Yeah, we have your first slide on the screen.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I think we already have a lot of interesting discussions. So I'm just going to focus my talk on the clinical validation for medical device software that uses LLMs and from notified bodies perspective. So I'll just focus this talk on the clinical evaluation part of the conformity assessment. A little bit about us. My name is Yun. I am a medical doctor. I work for a company called Scarlet, and Scarlet is a notified body. We specialize in AI and in assessing AI as medical devices and software as medical devices. And if you are interested to learn more about us, this is the website scarlet.cc. We have a lot of information that you may find useful. For example, we have some videos that you can watch or some blog posts if you are interested to learn more about our perspective on medical device regulations. And a little bit about myself. I'm a medical doctor by background, as I mentioned. I qualified in Heidelberg as a doctor, and this is where my very first job as a doctor was. I was working at a spinal cord injury center. I think that's really what sparked my interest in medical devices. I saw lots of patients really benefiting from technology every day. And I then moved to another hospital. I worked both in neurology and oncology, and then moved into digital health. I mostly work with electronic health records in clinical informatics before then moving to Scarlet as an internal clinician / clinical assessor. So when we talk about clinical validation for AI as medical devices, I think a lot of people feel like this is an entirely different topic, but fundamentally as a notified body, I think the basic question, the fundamental question we ask when assessing the medical device is really what evidence gives confidence that your device is safe and performs as intended in clinical practice. So this is the high-level principle. Like ultimately, this is safety and performance is what we want to demonstrate. And so I think when it comes to LLM devices, the high-level clinical evaluation principles are the same. So we want to see, well, does the device achieve its intended clinical purpose? Can the manufacturer demonstrate the clinical benefits using clinical data available, and whether the manufacturer has considered all the applicable risks and determine that they are acceptable, and whether benefit risks remain favorable throughout the life cycle. So these are the questions that we have to answer. And I think to answer some of the questions that we already discussed between the session, I think to a lot of those questions, my answers would be, it really depends on your intended purpose. So as Leon has mentioned, if you have a device with very broad intended purpose, then yes, it makes it very difficult or more difficult to then demonstrate that your device really performs as intended, because it means that there are a wider range of subgroups you have to consider. So I think what we have seen with manufacturer is that manufacturer choose to start with a smaller area. So instead of trying to cover every single possible areas in medicine, I think they will start with maybe a subset of specialty, or maybe they will start with a subset of question or subset of disease area that they want to tackle. And so the first step when assessing medical device for us, and also when proposing the technical documentation from the manufacturer, I think the first step is really to define what's your intended purpose, who are the target patients, what kind of situation can the device be used, whether it's for acute medicine or maybe or more for day-to-day GP management, or something that can be used in emergency situation. They should be clearly defined the intended purpose. And then accordingly, you have your clinical benefit claims. And based on the clinical benefit claim, you then need to decide what your endpoints are, how much data you would need to collect in order to be able to demonstrate the safety and performance of your device. And I think that what's often forgotten is the PMS and PMCF plan. So when we are conducting the conformity assessment, post-market surveillance plan is a very important part that we look at. But for some reason, this part is often, I think, somehow neglected or not really the focus of a lot of manufacturers. I think many people seem to think that this is something that you can deal with post-market, but actually pre-market, while we were evaluating your technical documentation, we will look into how it is planned and how you plan to continue to collect your data post-market. So what makes LLM clinical evaluation difference? I think, as we have discussed, like the technology has evolved so fast in the last few years, and it keeps changing. Like every 6 months, every few months, there will be they will have new feature, or it gets smarter. It's able to understand and perform more complex tasks. So it makes the scope of evidence broader compared to a traditional device. So one important question when we consider and we ask when we're assessing medical device software is really, is the manufacturer able to demonstrate generalizability of its device? And things we look at is whether the clinical data that's provided by the manufacturer are they representative of the entire range of intended scope, or does it cover all the clinical domains and tasks and user group that's defined in the intended purpose? And then and we'd like to see how manufacturers justify why the validation data set that's in use can be extrapolated to the intended use, and how we can use to support the entire range of intended purpose specified in device descriptions. And then we would like to see whether like important edge cases are covered, whether risks are assessed, and whether there are any gaps in evidence. Any gaps and limitation that are identified. So one important question we always ask is whether data is representative of all the potential subgroup and the use environments. And so I think that what a lot of manufacturers struggle with is what representative means. So for example, if you have an AI device that can draft consultation summaries and maybe suggest diagnosis or propose next steps, if this is the intended purpose, and we want to see that all the potential disease areas are covered in your data sets when you are validating your device. So sometimes manufacturer may look for random samples they just take random sample from GP practice. So from the GP practice, from the general practitioner, they may have a large number of consultation records and then test on the consultation records. But what we'll look at is not just the number of consultation that has been used in the device validation, but also what are the cases that have been used in the clinical validation in order to test for the performance. So if a manufacturer has a large number of respiratory diseases from the GP practice, maybe because it's the flu season, so most people come to a GP practice because of respiratory diseases, and most of these patients are adults, and all of them are just routine appointments. This would suggest to us that it doesn't really cover the entire range of the disease that is commonly seen at the GP consultations. And what a good representative sample will be is really one that covers different areas. So acute illness, chronic illness, maybe mental health, and maybe someone for drug reviews. Or we want to see whether if your intended purpose is supposed to cover everybody, so including children and LD patient, then we also like to see that the data you had used to generate performance data also includes pediatric groups and elderly patients. So really that your data set that's used for the validation should cover the entire range of the intended purpose. And I think oftentimes, I think it's easy to remember that you need to consider all the different subgroup populations, or like the age and gender, comorbidity of different patients. But I think what's also important is whether if you have a medical device driven by LLM that really can cover a wide range of scenarios, then you also need to consider other dimensions, like have you considered acute medicine, chronic medicine, emergency services, and in your clinical data generation activity. And also, if it's LLM, what kind of inputs are used? Have you tested out different inputs? And if your device has multiple different tasks, have you tested your data, your device on the performance of different tasks, that's covered by the intended purpose. And I think one thing that we also often take into consideration is the intended user. So you may test your device, but all the test users you include in your studies are very experienced users. Then we may also ask a question like, how about someone who's more a junior doctor, someone who's less experienced in medicines? Are they also able to use the device? And have you considered, do you have any data how they will perform using this device? Or have you considered whether there's any risk that's maybe specific for doctors who are less experienced? So it really depends on how you define your intended purpose. If your intended purpose is very broad, then you do need to have data that can cover the entire range of the intended purpose. I think what we often see now, at least currently for the medical device we are evaluating, I think manufacturers tend to limit the intended purpose so that the data they can demonstrate now can support the performance safety of the intended purpose. And so we talk about what makes good clinical validation. It's important to have the representative subgroups, important to have good endpoints, appropriate comparators. But I think that one thing that is often forgotten is really that we look to see whether manufacturers discuss their limitations transparently. Because I'm sure everyone knows that if you have LLM devices, it is just not possible to really test for every possible use cases that your device can support. So if you have done your subgroup analysis, if you have collect your data, you've done a performance, what we like to see is whether there's any gap in your data that you have identified or whether there's any limitations. And it's better to discuss the limitations transparently than trying to hide the limitation and just claim that your device performs well, because these are exactly the detail we'll look at, whether there are any limitation that's been identified and you'll continue to address during your post-market surveillance activity. And so I think like this question has been asked, and I think this question we get asked a lot. If I have an LLM-driven device, how do I demonstrate conformity? Because basically the device can perform a very wide range of tasks. And I think our answer is clinical evaluation should be informed by the risk of the device. So what we'll look to see is has the manufacturer identified all relevant risks for the medical device, and has the most risky situations been adequately evaluated, and whether the manufacturer has considered all the potential hazards and hazardous situation that can lead to harm, and how these risks are controlled, and whether there are any limitations, and these limitations should be documented in the clinical evaluation report, and also we'll look to see whether how a manufacturer then intend to address this limitation in the post-market phase, and whether there are still any residual risk after you have done your risk analysis, you've done the risk control. Do you think the risk, even though there are risks, are they acceptable? And I think ultimately, if you conclude like, yes, we have identified these are the risks associated with a medical device. However, these are also the benefit we can demonstrate based on the performance data what the device can bring to the market, and you can demonstrate that the benefit outweigh the risk. Then this would be acceptable for the conformity assessment. So overall, I think this is a question manufacturers should aim to answer, whether the benefit risk profile is favorable. So we understand that it's not possible for manufacturer to really test out any scenario, but then we would like to see how the risk and foreseeable risks and hazards are appropriately considered and also controlled in your risk management. So, for example, if you have a very generic radiology report drafting software, and you have already done your clinical evaluation, you have a large data set with like different type of chest X-ray, different chest CT, and you look at different pulmonary nodules, but in your clinical evaluation, you realize and recognize that you don't have sufficient data for rare interstitial lung diseases because they're quite rare and the data are harder to find. This does not necessarily mean that your device cannot be certified, but rather we'd like to see how manufacturers discuss this in the clinical evaluation reports. So, for example, I think like one way to really one way to look at that is that we'd like to see what are the potential risks that can be associated with the device making the wrong judgment because it's a rare disease that it doesn't recognize. What's the worst outcome it could happen? And then do you have any risk control measure that is in place to reduce the harm that could be associated with the device not recognizing a rare disease? And a lot of devices we see these days, they still have human oversight. So that could be one way of the risk control, that the users are instructed that the AI output may not support rarer diseases, and so they still need a clinician to make the final judgment. If you can justify that, you're saying that because the clinician is still there and they will make the final judgment, so this risk is mitigated, then this could be a way to demonstrate conformity and demonstrate performance and safety of your device. And then ideally, we want to see how this will then be addressed post-market. So if you know that this is a limitation, you don't have enough data for certain disease or certain patient population because these are like rarer, not as often. I would like to see how the PMS and PMCF activity will specifically target this gap that you identify during your pre-markets. So I think a principle we usually follow at Scarlet is, do you have enough data pre-market to demonstrate conformity? Do you have enough data to demonstrate that your device is safe and perform as intended? And if there are gaps, these gaps can be addressed post-market as long as they don't constitute unacceptable residual risk. So then another consideration that's specific to LLM is variability. So traditional with a traditional algorithm, the same input gives you the same output, but then with LLM, the same input may not give you the same output. So I think in the clinical evaluation, we would like to see whether you have considered this, and then how do you address this? So in the testing, you may test for one output input, and then you may demonstrate that there may be like 5 different variants that the device can provide. We would like to know whether all these different answers, they may be slightly different in the wording, they may be slightly different in the way that this problem is structured, but are all the output as good? Are they all clinically acceptable? So these are sort of consideration that we would like to see that's been discussed and considered in the clinical evaluation. Then hallucination, I think this is a topic that's been talked a lot about when it comes to AI and LLM. So when it comes to this, I think what we like to see is not justification saying that, yes, the device can hallucinate, but it's very rare. So I think just by justifying the frequency of the hallucination is usually not enough to justify safety and performance. I think what we really like to see is how would the hallucination impact the safety of the patients. if it happens. So even if you can demonstrate that your hallucination does not happen very often, we still want to see that what's the worst possible outcome that could happen if it hallucinates and gives the false answer. And then again, we'd like to see the risk control measure you have in place and the mitigation. As I think Estelle already mentioned, like continuous clinical evaluation is very important for LLM because the foundation models can be updated very frequently, or there may be changes in the performance of the device over time. The guidelines might change, or the clinical state of the art might change. So it's important that you have a post-market surveillance plan that you continue to address the issue post-market. And I have prepared some questions that we often hear from manufacturers. I think one question we get asked a lot is, how much data do I need? Like, how big should the sample size be? And the answer is really, we need to see that you have justified why your sample size, why you think the sample size you have is significant enough to support the intended purpose of your device. So it's really not a fixed number we're looking for. I think some manufacturer expect us to give them a number like 1,000 is good or 2,000 is good, but it really depends on how you justify your sample size, why you think that this is the number that is the minimum that you will need to collect in order to demonstrate safety and performance for a particular subgroup. And then another question they often get asked is that, do I need a prospective study? So again, not necessarily, and it depends on the intended purpose of your device and how much clinical data you need, how much data you need to support your intended purpose. So the EU MDR requires manufacturer to also to justify and decide how much clinical data they will need to collect. A prospective study or clinical investigation is usually required if you have a class 3 high-risk device. For class 2A and class 2B devices, you may be able to rely on retrospective data to demonstrate performance and safety. But then again, what we would like to see is sorry, is there a question?
Yeah, may I ask you a question? Can I interrupt you for 1 second? So this is one question I struggle with, especially in the example I gave, right, where you have an LLM, or for example, it interacts with a user and you don't know what the output is going to be. And I guess there could be situations where the device is really low risk. Let's say you would have an LLM to interact on very simple, low risk complaints related to a disease. But the outcome is super unpredictable, and you're going to say that there could be a benefit by the use of the device because you need to define your clinical benefit. Do you think there's in any way then a possibility to use retrospective data because the outcome is so unpredictable? I struggle for myself in my head to formulate a good answer to this. So I could imagine you also may not have a perfect answer, but I would expect that even for low risk products, because the outcome is so hard to predict, you would very quickly be required to have a prospective randomized controlled trial to demonstrate that there actually is a clinical benefit.
So I think in order to demonstrate, so I think it is still possible to use retrospective data to test how many different output this device could give. I think if it really can give you unlimited number or unlimited variance of output of answers, I guess the question is why would there be so many different variants of answers if the device is low risk and you're asking a simple question, like why would there be so many different questions and answer to that question? And I guess if there is not appropriate justification for that, or is the manufacturer still think that with the retrospective data alone you won't be able to test all the possible scenario, then yes, perhaps the prospective study is necessary. But I guess it really depends on what the device does and what it claims that you can do.
You have 3 more questions. Shall I pull them out? Shall I, how do you say, moderate? Is that okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
So Deanna,
Sure.
you want to go first?
Yeah.
You're the first one with him.
Yeah. Thank you. So we like more or less how to demonstrate that the risk of automation bias is under control, or that there are measures, because like we are humans and sometimes I got lost for following my wrong Google Maps. So I can imagine that can happen on a clinical settings, and also about bias and fairness, because we know how biased the training data could be, and that could affect some minorities or particular group. You mentioned generalizability. And finally, like I know that the LLMs change per language. So if you, for instance, certify in English, then you cannot use French, for instance, because then it will be a different result. So I hope my question was clear. But we're actually 3 questions.
So what is the questions? I've had a statement, like, so yes, is a question about automation bias and how to.
Yeah, maybe the first question is indeed how to manage automation bias and establish what a user, what the impact is of automation bias on a device in general when using an LLM.
So I think like what we have seen manufacturers do, like, especially in terms of automation bias, is to do usability studies and then determine like what kind of risk or what kind of hazards or hazardous situation are associated with automation biases, and then conduct risk analysis to then know like what's the worst outcome if a clinician miss something. So again, like, it depends on intended purpose. So if there's a device that just tell you whether someone has some radiology reporting system, it summarizes the radiology image and tells you the outcome. So what could be the worst possible outcome? If your device is really very general, you can detect cancer. So then maybe the worst possible outcome, then it could be missed diagnosis or delayed diagnosis. But then it also depends on the workflow of how your device is used. So is it used complete on its own, or is that something that you'll be reviewed by clinicians? So I think the first step is to identify how can the automation bias happen, and then to demonstrate to what you think is reasonable to expect when the automation bias happens, and how it could affect the patients, and then to justify that. If you still think, because in the workflow, for example, a clinician is not completely automated, there will be a check, there will be another check, or there will be another opportunity for a clinician to pick it up, and then maybe there could be a justification, and then this would be like your pre-market. This probably be your pre-market assessment that you feel like this is the residual risk is controlled. And then post-market, you could do a prospective study to then continue to collect how it's actually used in actual clinical practice.
Clear, thank
and
you.
I guess this is the same principle also apply to bias and minority groups. So pre-market, you may test on some minority patients, but you don't have enough patient with different skin color, for example. So we've seen that with devices that's used in dermatology. They have tests on different patients, but they are maybe patient with fairer skin, but they don't have patient with darker skin. This is something that they identify as a limitation in the current studies. So I think what the manufacturer done is that they'll put a warning to the device, that they warn the user that the device may not perform as intended, or may not perform as well for people with certain skin color. And then they propose a post-market surveillance activity to then collect more data on these minority groups.
I think we have 2 other questions, Deanna. If it's okay for you, then I'll just continue. Otherwise, we're not going to get through the evening, and I think you may still have some other slides. So Sebastian,
I only have one more slide. So, and also there's another question, so I can jump into discussion.
Sebastian, you want to ask your question?
Yes, very interesting talk. I have a question regarding things like LLM as a judge, which I imagine you are aware of. So using an LLM to assess the capabilities of your LLM. So something I noticed with tasks like summarization or also the X-ray example that you took is, well, we have these really massive X-ray data sets for report generation, for example, and the tasks are kind of more easy to evaluate in the sense that you might have a classification task. Can my model say whether an X-ray shows a pathology or not? And there's like kind of a more clearly defined yes or no answer. But when you, let's say you see much more conversational LLMs or conversational systems being introduced, where you have to assess multi-turn conversations, and something that a lot of people in the evaluation space do is training LLMs that act as a patient, or also use LLMs to assess whether the model has completed a task according to whatever guidelines you set to it. And I was wondering what your opinion is on using LLMs as an evaluation method, and where you see the pros and cons, or overall how you handle it in Scarlet.
I don't quite understand the question. Is that you use LLM to test as a validation tool to validate the actual device?
Yes. So something you could do is, let's say you have a consultation company that uses LLMs to ask people a few questions over, let's say, 10 conversational turns, and you want to probe the system that it works. So you need to kind of simulate these turns, and you can use an LLM for that, and have on top of that an LLM that judges how well your system actually handled that situation. And I was wondering if you have come across that in your work and what your thoughts are on that.
And are you talking about this in the medical device context of how, in the medical evaluation context, or in general, when people use LLM to generate data that's then being used to test the performance of the device? I have seen so this is a company, I have seen a company doing this, but this is not a technical performance. So I've seen a company that use LM to generate test case, and then they use that test case to test the performance of how their own device perform when asked different questions. And then they don't have I think your question is more on and how whether LLM can then be used to judge the conversation between the state user and also the device. Is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, I know that it is being used, and there is a lot of pros and cons. I was curious how you see it from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, I feel like fundamentally whenever like manufacturer have some creative ways of demonstrating their clinical evaluation, we always find quite interesting. But then ultimately, I think the principle is the same. So if you use an LM to evaluate the performance, how do you train it to evaluate performance? Like, what are the criteria that you use to to judge whether this is a good interaction or bad interaction? Like, is this process do you have a defined process for the LM to perform that task? And we would like to see how that's documented and demonstrate to us as a notified body, and whether we can see that this is a fair process. I think if you can demonstrate that this is a fair process, that it could be an interesting way to look at this.
Yeah, I think this is the last thing I will say. What Leon has mentioned, like kind of the gold standard is doing an RCT, right? And there's a lot of considerations. Well, what if I change some of my prompts? Do I have to do an RCT again, which would be completely unfeasible? So some of the idea is, if I can demonstrate that my AI-driven simulation can perform in a similar way that an RCT would do, can I then use that as an evaluation whenever I change some of the prompts to like evidence that my prompt hasn't regressed the capability of my system? But anyways, I will stop talking now.
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. I think like we have a lot of discussion about whether people can use synthetic data, but probably like slightly different to your question, but whether synthetic data can be used to test LLM. And I think like, yes, I think generally, I think we will accept it as part of the evidence, but probably not just on its own. So for example, if you already have done some test studies with real patient, real human, real interaction, but you feel like you wanted to supplement your study, your clinical evidence with then more of this synthetic interactions, because for whatever for other reason you can't repeat the study. I think that it's an acceptable approach. But then I think what we would like to understand is that how do you do your risk assessment? Like, have you considered this as a potential weakness in your clinical evaluation strategy? Is that, does it cause any gaps or any limitations? I think that's what we want to see, whether that's being discussed transparently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoon. And indeed, I think also the MDR IVDR proposal is setting forward an extension of Article 610, under which they will allow the use potentially of synthetic data. They're adding in silico data as an option for avoiding the use of clinical investigation, and also computational modeling and algorithm validation, I think, which is an interesting development to see. Ben, you also have a question?
Well, hi, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I'll try to be quick because I know the time is very short. And also, I hope that my question will be clear because I'm asking on behalf of my friend. Okay, so she's asking that the framework is modality agnostic, but the evidence clearly is not. So for open-ended LLM, outputs where there is no single ground truth, what does a notified body currently accept as a adequate performance evidence? And how do you validate a multimodal system where the modalities can disagree with each other? So this is my question.
So I think like what do you mean like there is no single ground truth? Do you mean that there's not a single good answer that the device can provide?
Yeah, that I think that's probably, because to be honest, I'm not into medical. I'm a software developer, and we're trying to develop an idea, and that's why she just sent me the message and.
Okay. And yes, I think like traditionally, when with like those like traditional model, when it's just classification, you have a yes and no answer. It's much easier to then validate your result because it's just a single ground truth. I think with LLM, instead of expecting one single ground truth, we probably would want to expect a range of answers. So I guess like one way to look at it is that when you are validating your output and the performance of output, and there's not just one right answer, but maybe a range of answers that could be acceptable when it's produced by the LLM. So yeah, that's how we look at it. I think we have a blog post on this topic.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate it.
There's one more question right now, and then I suggest after this question we continue to your last slide, Yoon, and then we can start rounding it up. Amel?
Yeah, can you hear my question? Can you hear me?
Yeah, clear.
Okay, so my question is kind of follow-up related to the two other previous questions. So for LLM, do you expect the validation to be deterministic? So for example, you give an LLM a question and you get an answer, and then there's a human that validates the answer is correct. Or could you use, for example, as Marseille was saying, that you use another LLM to validate the answer is correct? Or does it always have to be a human that validating the answer is correct when you're testing your LLM models?
So I think if you use the LLM to then test whether the answer is correct, actually in both cases, I think what we expect is that it doesn't have to be one correct answer, but then it should be a range of correct answers. So I guess if with humans, it's probably easier. You can have a clinician who can review the answer from the LLM and decide, yes, whether this answer is acceptable or not. And then depending, there are different ways of doing this. So this is just one idea that I have on top of my head, that you can have a clinician to judge, yes, this is an acceptable answer because even though it's slightly different from the previous answer, but this is a correct medical judgment. I mean, even in medicine, every doctor might not make the exact same judgment. So I think as long you can test and validate that, that's fine. That you don't have the yes, you don't have just have deterministic answer, but maybe you should have the range of acceptable answers. And I guess if you use an LM to make that judgment because you want to test a wide range of test case, I think it's possible that you use LM to do a judgment, but you probably should demonstrate how you train the validating the LM to perform the task correctly, like how you ensure that you actually, it gives you the right data, the right assessment. And that could be a challenging part in your technical documentation, whether you'll be able to demonstrate that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, and let's go to the last slide, Yun.
Yeah, I just have one last question that was open here is that people would call that with traditional AI, especially people ask the question that whether 95% accuracy is enough for the model, or like what is the accuracy that we're expected. And so, well, the answer is that I think like one performance metric alone is rarely enough for clinical evaluation. So what we want to understand is that why you decide to measure accuracy and not another parameter, and like how do you decide what is the state of the art? Because state of the art should be your benchmark. And also a question we ask is that for a similar device using the same technology, what are the usual performance metrics that's used? And are you measuring the same thing? And how does it compare to other similar device or compare to the state of the art? So there's really not a single number that we're assessing when it comes to conformity assessment. So that's my last slide.
Super. A very big thanks, Yun. I think you provided a lot of information, in the sense of a lot of information and practical guidance, and also from the view of Scarlet. And I think this is exactly what organizations today are looking for, because it's very hard to get by this information if you're not actively engaging with a notified body yet, or if you're not yet having the opportunity to engage in a structured dialogue. So thanks a lot for giving that openness and providing that. It's truly helpful. So a big applause to you, and also obviously to Cécile for her end of the presentation. We usually schedule the meetup from 7:30 to 9:30. If people, some people have already dropped off. Maybe there are some last-minute questions. People who want to add something to the conversation, feel free. We still have 10 minutes left, or otherwise I'd also be happy to drop off and everyone to let people go and enjoy their evenings. But yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Let's say a lot of items at the same time. Sorry, but Diana, I think you were first, so go ahead.
Yeah, it was about the language, because I know the tokens cost different if it's in Mandarin or English or Spanish. So then my question is that if Scarlet, for instance, certifies an LLM in English, you can only use it in English, and if it's a different language, you need to validate again?
I think this is an interesting question, and we actually have this discussion with some manufacturers. So I'm not an AI scientist. I think it depends on the LLM models you use. I think that the trend now, some of the AI models, they are, when it's thinking, it's not actually thinking in English, it's thinking in its own language. And then when it has the output after it finishes thoughts, it then like give you the answer in whatever language that you want. So if there's a model you're using, I feel that there might be an opportunity to then justify that your device is language agnostic, because it will give you an output. It really depends on like the language that you choose to communicate with. But then that would need to be part of your risk management and your maybe also understanding the software as unknown provenance, because that would be the functionality that's provided by the LM, the foundation model, rather than by your company. But then if you use a more traditional model that actually like requires translation or language use, I guess then yes, you have to demonstrate that how you can demonstrate performance and safety. And Yeah, so I think it depends on intended purpose and what you can provide as, like demonstrate the technology and the model behind that.
Thanks.
Thanks. Then I think I lost count, but I think I see Tom with a hand up. I don't see any other hands up at this moment, so go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well, June, for the presentation and answering all the questions. I had a question for, actually 2 questions. So first question is about the specific uses of large language models, where I can really imagine that there would be a trial needed, but the design of such a trial would be very difficult. For example, in cases where you would use an LLM for triaging patients to emergency wards, for example, because in such cases the LLM can be used very broadly, and you easily lose the follow-up of potentially some high-risk patients there. In those cases, and I can also imagine that not a lot of manufacturers will be able to perform such an analysis. Do you foresee something like the AI sandbox kind of being a solution there, or how do you feel about those kinds of potentially high risk AI devices where it would be difficult to collect sufficient clinical data in practice?
Is there a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that in the scenario you described, it does sound like it's a high-risk medical device, and it's most likely going to fall under Class 3 medical devices. I think for a Class 3 medical device in the EU MDR, it will be hard to avoid doing a clinical investigation. So you would need to collect prospective data on the high-risk medical devices.
Yeah, but what I mean is that the design of a trial of such an investigation would then it would be also very difficult. But yeah, I mean that I've heard these kinds of ideas popping up with a lot of startup companies already, who are like doing some phone triaging for patients calling the emergency wards, and with the potential benefits of really helping emergency wards operate more efficiently, then I can really foresee this coming into practice. But I'm really struggling with finding how do you design such a trial with the current rules and regulations and ensure that it's appropriately managed afterwards.
Okay, so I think like so I initially understood emergency ward as like you're using in ICU. But if your question is more along like triage tools, like people may come in with different type of device, different scenarios. Yes, we have seen manufacturer with those devices, and a lot of them are Class 2B. And the reason they could be Class 2B is that oftentimes they will have a person in the loop, so they will have some sort of system that. For example, if someone has a red flag symptoms, so it will be sent to a human rather than completely managed by an AI or LLM. I think if you really have a system, we have not seen something that is like completely managed by the LLM. LLM just manage the whole, the whole workflow and triage. If there's something like that, I guess like Class 3, it's probably unavoidable, and you will have to do a difficult clinical trials, really to demonstrate that this is safe. But then if you have a tool that's triaging, and you're not always triaging ICU patient, you can be triaging patient with very minor thing like cough, but also something more acute like stroke. I think that what oftentimes we see is that manufacturer putting some risk control in that, and that risk control is, like I say, that they will throw a patient with red flag symptoms out because these are the high risk patients that they should immediately be seen by humans, and the rest can be managed by the device. And then if you can demonstrate that the device is safe because the higher risk patients will be managed by more urgently, I guess like that's a way to design to provide sufficient data to demonstrate performance.
Yes, thank you very much. And then I also had a question because as a manufacturer, I can imagine that you would like to collect the data, and then if you think your technical file is complete, then you submit to the notified body. So if you assume that you could use retrospective data, and once you submit to the notified body, it gets rejected because you need to do a clinical trial, you get set back a lot of time. So what would you advise on doing that? Would you recommend doing a structured dialogue for each of these files? Because I can imagine that as a notified body, you cannot do a structured dialogue with each and every manufacturer who has a question at the start of their journey as well, right?
Oh, actually, we do offer structured dialogue for each one of our clients. So there is opportunity for us to talk to each of our clients early on. The restriction is that we cannot talk to you every time you have a question. So we cannot discuss the same topic multiple times because we are not consultancy, but we can give you, if you have you already have a plan, you have some preliminary data, we're always happy to discuss with you during the structured dialogue, whether you're going the right direction or you're completely off.
I wish our customers would ask us the same question and pay us every time they ask us the same question. That would be nice. But thanks a lot, Hsuan, for your feedback and for the presentation. I think we need to round it up. We're neatly on time. Thanks a lot to everyone for joining this session. I hope you found it useful. If people have specific topics they would like to bring up for future SAMD meetups, feel free to reach out. We have the LinkedIn channel. There is the SAMD Meetup website. And on top of it, I think, what was I going to say? I don't remember. So I'll post a video on YouTube as soon as we can so that people can look it back. And that's about it. So thanks a lot for everyone's participation and see you next time.